They swept down from the mountains like a torrent and roared over the land. Half man they seemed, half beast, as wild as the hills they emerged from. In battle, none were more reckless, none more fearless. So terrible did they appear that their foes might turn and run before a blow was struck. They fought for nothing less than victory and mocked death itself. BC, a Celtic army marches to battle. A hunger for land, a craving for booty, pushes them on mile after mile. No obstacle, natural or human, hinders the wild men of Western Europe. Their enemy, the small young state called Rome, has never met such a foe. Much later, the historian Livy would record their coming with alarm. Too late for his countrymen.
A strange foe of whose power Rome knew nothing was on the march from the Atlantic Ocean and the farthest shores of the world. They flamed into the uncontrollable anger characteristic of their race and set forward with terrible speed on the path to Rome.
The Celts' exploits would be handed down by their victims, the Romans. They left no records of their own. Of their lives before, little is known. But by the 4th century BC, Europe was covered by a mosaic of Celtic tribes. Loosely joined by language, custom, and belief, the clans came to blows with one another over land, or wealth, or simply pride. Throughout the countryside, poor families tilled the soil on behalf of a nobleman. In return for a share of their harvest, they received the protection of his sword. Each Celtic tribe was led by a king and his chieftains, yet they could make no decision without the assembly of nobles, the men who held power, since they were the men who fought. In peacetime, they quarreled and dueled among themselves without cease. In time of war, they were invincible. At the end of the 4th century BC, a group of such men was called upon to gather their goods and their families and head south to Italy. There they would make new homes.
The king, wishing to relieve his kingdom of the burdensome excess of the population, announced his intention of sending his 2 nephews, both of them adventurous young men, out into the world to find such new homes as the gods by signs from heaven might point the way to.
There were plenty of adventurous young men to make the journey. From childhood, the sons of noblemen were taught the ways of war.
Fathers do not allow their sons to approach them openly until they have grown to an age when they can bear the burden of military service.
The king's nephews had grown up with swords and spears and shields. Together, the youths of the tribe had trained and hunted, feasted and drunk. Now, together, they would fight.
They set out with a vast host, some mounted, some on foot, and reached the foot of the Alps. Those sky peaks into another world. These they crossed. They defeated the Etruscans and founded the town of Mediolanum.
Mediolanum, later to be called Milan, was one of many settlements carved out of the land of the Etruscans. Boasting of their courage, feasting on glory, the Celts dared anyone to challenge them in their new homeland. The challenge went unanswered. In battle, the Celts feared no man. They trembled only before their gods. A superstitious people, tribes followed their own deities. Though Lu, god of the sun, was worshipped by all. For a Celt, there was no hell, simply death and certain rebirth in a glorious afterlife. To a warrior who believed he would rise from his grave like the phoenix, death held no terror. The unfortunate Etruscans, fearful of their own mortality at the hands of the Celts, sought help from a neighbor to the south, a small city-state named Rome. The Romans sent north an army several thousand strong, confident they could expel the invader.
The Roman army had covered hardly 11 miles before it met the invaders, where the river Alia descends in a deep gully from the hills. The ground in front and on both sides was already swarming with enemy soldiers.
The Celts dressed in brightly colored tunics and checkered cloaks. Round their necks, they wore richly patterned torques. On their bodies, armbands, rings, jewels. As artists, these pagans were unequaled. Their ornate designs would reappear in another age, on the pages of the Gospels. The superstitious transformed into the sacred. Most warriors entered battle armed with only a spear and a shield. Some spearheads measured up to 20 inches in length. Others had undulating blades to mangle flesh. A nobleman's greatest weapon was his sword. Crafted by skilled blacksmiths, it was sturdily forged, not for thrusting, but slashing. Over time, swords were made even larger, up to 3 feet long. The finest swords, the privilege of the wealthiest men, were studded with precious stones to awe a foe from afar. Up close, their length and strength made a fearful impression. Before battle had even begun, the Celts could terrify their enemy into flight by their very appearance. A tall race of men, half naked, screaming and thrashing, their hair smeared with lime to stand up in spikes. They looked to the Romans like apparitions from the underworld. Even their helmets seemed the work of demons.
On their heads, they wear bronze helmets with large projecting figures, lending the appearance of enormous stature to the wearer.
Near the river Allia, the Celts gathered, more mob than army. Though motley in dress, they were united by their battle standards, animals of the forest and birds of prey. Whipping themselves into a frenzy, the warriors raised their terrible cries, broke into chants, and sang hymns of war. Now and then, a lone Celt would step forward and dare an opponent to fight. Above the din, the Romans heard the fearsome call of the Carnix, the Celtic battle horn.
The Roman commanders had taken no precautions. They drew up their line on as broad a front as they could, hoping not to be outflanked by the enemy's superior numbers. But the hope was vain.
Brennus, the Gallic chieftain, sized up the Roman army. Outnumbered, outflanked, unnerved. He ordered his men to attack. Every man threw himself into the fray.
The Celts overran all the ground, in front and on both sides. At the first sound of the Gallic war cry, the legionaries fled in panic, so blinded to everything but saving their skins, hardly waiting even to see their strange enemy from the ends of the earth. None fell fighting. They were cut down from behind as they struggled to force a way to safety through the heaving mass of their fellow fugitives. Near the bank of the river, there was a dreadful slaughter. The whole left wing of the army had gone that way and had flung away their arms in a desperate hope of getting over. Many could not swim, and many others, in their exhausted state, were dragged underwater by the weight of their equipment and drowned. The Celts could hardly believe their eyes. For a while they stood rooted to the spot, hardly realizing what had happened. Then, after a moment of fear, lest the whole thing were a trap, they began to collect the arms and equipment of the dead.
As night fell, the Celts, victorious again, made camp. Nothing stood between them and the spoils of war. The rich city of Rome. The next day, the Celts stormed through the city gates. No Roman came out to resist them. the citizens had barricaded themselves on a hill within the capital. The wild men of Europe gazed dumbstruck at sights they had never beheld, high temples and grand buildings. Then they turned to plunder.
For the Romans, the full horror was almost too great to realize. Fate had made them spectators of the nightmare stage scene of their country's ruin.
The Celtic leader Brennus strode up to the senators at the capital and delivered an ultimatum. Pay a ransom and his men would leave. If not, the nightmare the Romans were living would seem merely a dream next to what would follow. The citizens brought gold and jewels to be tallied up, then complained at the way the booty was being weighed. Brennus is said to have added his heavy sword to the scales and declared, "Vae victis!" Woe to the conquered! When the tribute had been paid, the Celts were true to their word. They marched away. It was a mistake they would regret. Northern Italy now belonged to the Celts. A stream of invaders flowed into the vast plain of the Po River. The Romans themselves acknowledged the new inhabitants by calling the region Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul this side of the Alps. Within a century after the battle by the river Allia, the Celtic world reached its zenith. Those called Gauls by the Romans would leave their mark throughout Europe. Galicia in Spain, Galatia in Turkey, Galicia in Poland. After their defeat in 390 BC, the Romans set about restoring their city, building their army, and biding their time. In 225 BC, almost 2 centuries after their triumph at the river Allia, a huge Celtic army from all over northern Italy and beyond again threatened Rome. 50,000 infantry and 20,000 horses and chariots confronted a Roman force sent to stop them and swept it aside. 80 miles from the capital, the Celts halted. 2 Roman legions, 8,000 strong, blocked their path. Satisfied with the booty they had plundered, the Celts this time turned back. This time, the Romans followed. Unknown to the Celts, another Roman army had appeared behind them, occupying a hill near the village of Telamon and cutting off retreat. Beset on 2 sides, the Celts deployed back to back and prepared to fight in both directions.
The Romans were on the one hand encouraged by having caught the enemy between their 2 armies, but on the other hand they were terrified by the fine order of the Celtic host and the dreadful din. Very terrifying, too, were the appearance and the gestures of the warriors in front.
The battle was as fierce as the Celts themselves, but this day, reckless bravery and hard steel would meet their match. When the enemies first clashed 2 centuries before, the Romans had carried small, round shields that proved useless against the great slashing swords. Now, each Roman was protected by a shield almost as long as his body. The Romans had learned something more: how to stop the Celts' wild charges. The answer was the javelin. Against the lightly armored Celts, this missile proved deadly. The Celts who survived the barrage were shoved back by the large shields of the Romans. Herded together, the Celts had no room to swing their long swords. From behind a wall of shields, the Romans thrust their newest weapon, a short blade, into naked flesh.
The main body of Celts met the enemy and kept up a stubborn hand-to-hand combat. For though being almost cut to pieces, they held their ground, equal to their foe in courage and inferior only in their weapons.
The Romans recorded that 10,000 Celts were captured. 40,000 were killed. The wild men of Europe had been broken.
This success encouraged the Romans to hope they would be able to entirely expel the Celts from the plain of the Po. A war which, if we look to the desperation and the daring of the combatants, and the numbers who took part and perished in battle, is second to no war in history.
In the next century, Rome grew only stronger as the land of the Celts shrank. Disunited, outfought, the Celtic tribes, one by one, were overwhelmed. By the end of the 1st century AD, the Celts had been driven from Italy, from Gaul, even from England. The tribes who once held Rome in their grip were pushed back to the place they had come from. The lands described by the Roman historian Livy, the farthest shores of the world.
On an autumn day almost 1,000 years ago, one of the greatest battles in history begins. Invaders have struck England, their prized weapon, an armored knight, a powerful horse, an unstoppable charge. Yet the charge is stopped by a wall of English shields. Before the sun sets, these knights of France will win England, or an English grave. In the year 1066, a whirlwind strikes England, the Normans. Among them, a young knight named Robert de Beaumont, one of the few whose bravery will be celebrated by the chroniclers. Victory could bring him farms, wealth, even a nobleman's title in this foreign land. Robert is a long way from home. Normandy, a thriving dukedom between Paris and the French coast. A place of rich soil, and productive mills. Wealthy manors and plentiful game. Such a fertile land was once a breeding ground for war. In Robert's boyhood, noble fought noble for the riches of Normandy. His own family emerged from those feuds well rewarded and well protected. Castles are built from the stone of the Norman countryside. Norman power is built upon the castle. Behind their walls, the de Beaumonts enjoy the fruits of success: revelry, feasting, music. The comforts of wealth are safeguarded by more than sturdy walls. They are protected by the most powerful man in the land, William, Duke of Normandy. But there is a price for such privilege. The de Beaumonts must supply their protector with warriors for up to 40 days each year. Not just their servants, but their sons. Since he was a boy, Robert trained for a new kind of warfare. Across the sea, the English still fight on foot as a mob, but the Normans have acquired the advantage of mobility and harnessed the power of the horse. When Robert is 20, his years of training are at last rewarded. Symbolically, his ears are boxed, the last blow he will ever take without striking back. Then he is handed his sword and his spurs and dubbed a knight. Born into such a rigid society, Robert cannot question his place. He can only try to survive it. He now owes allegiance to the man who has defeated every other baron in northern France and united Normandy under his rule, Duke William. Across the Channel, a new sovereign, Harold, has claimed the crown of England, but it lies uncertainly on his head. Other nobles dispute his title to the throne, including the Norman Duke who would be king. What William believes is his by right, he must now take by force. In the spring of 1066, William appeals for warriors in his quest for the English throne. His call is answered by 2,000 knights, including Robert de Beaumont. That summer, he joins a long line of soldiers, winding its way toward William's camp on the Norman coast. Freelances who roam from battle to battle, seeking their fortune. Light infantry, archers and slingers. Heavy infantry, expert with spear and battle axe. green recruits and scarred veterans. 8,000 men who will follow William across the sea. Robert de Beaumont is not obliged to go. He has pledged his sword for service at home. But England offers much more than mere service. Across the Channel lie the spoils of war. If victorious, William has promised to lavish his knights with titles, land, and a share of the plunder. Robert may never see such a chance again. The saga of William's quest will one day be woven into the fabric of history. Around the pillars of the cathedral in the French town of Bayeux, a record will stretch 20 inches high and 80 yards long. The Bayeux Tapestry. 900 years later, it will tell the whole story of the invasion of England, beginning with the great fleet William assembles to cross the Channel. By August, William has built or borrowed more than 700 ships. Robert de Beaumont's father contributes 60. Yet an ill wind blows from England. Until it shifts, the fleet is grounded. Robert is about to embark on a hazardous expedition. The sea crossing alone will cover more than 70 miles. He has heard of the roughness of the Channel and of the men on the other side. Against them, an army larger than William's would stand only an even chance. And yet there is a chance. The English have no cavalry, no knights. Their island breeds only ponies, not the Norman strong war horses. Most of all, the English do not know where to expect the invasion or when. If he reaches England, William will need a quick victory, for his other obstacle will be feeding his army. The horses alone need 13 tons of grain and 13 tons of hay every day. In Normandy, horses and soldiers alike eat well. The Norman historian William of Poitiers will record that here, the Duke has already won the battle of organization.
William made generous provision for his knights. He did not allow any of them to take their sustenance by force. The crops waited undisturbed for the sickle, without either being trampled by the knights in their pride or ravaged out of greed by plunderers.
The only enemies Robert fights now are boredom and tension. After 6 weeks, William's luck changes, and so does the wind. By nightfall, Robert is underway. A beacon on William's flagship guides the fleet in the darkness. The army sails with their horses in open boats, like their ancestors. For these Normans were once Norsemen, Vikings. 2 centuries earlier, their long ships brought terror to England's shores. Now, under the cover of night, the terror returns. Fair winds follow the Normans across the channel. Soon after dawn, they land. Luck is waiting for them. The English are not. Their attention has been drawn elsewhere. William takes no chances. His first move is defensive. His men cut down trees to build a castle of timber, a Norman contribution to the art of war. Above the cliffs at Hastings, William looks to his safety and wonders about his foe. Harold's kingdom is twice plagued. Another invader has landed, the King of Norway. Harold marches north and crushes him, but he has lost the battle against time. He cannot be in two places at once. Harold rushes back south to face William. On October 14th, the two armies meet near the village of Hastings. For Robert de Beaumont, the time to prove his mettle has come. Like every Norman knight, he will ride into battle covered in a suit of chainmail weighing 30 pounds, heavy but flexible and nearly impenetrable. It's called a hauberk. Made of thousands of interlocking iron rings, it reaches down to Robert's knees and elbows. Slits in the front and back allow him to sit astride his horse. A hood of chainmail protects his head and throat. By the time he dons an iron helmet, he is girded in up to 60 pounds of armor.
Corpus Christi. Amen.
Robert's strongest protection is faith, his belief that a glorious afterlife awaits should his earthly armor fail him. Slightly outnumbered, William deploys his army atop a low ridge. At the rear wait his horsemen, 2,000 knights and freelances. 10 rows in front of Robert are the archers, to thin the English ranks. Between horsemen and archers, the heavy infantry. Like Robert, they wear hauberk and helmet. Some wield double-edged swords for thrusting or slashing. Others maces and spears. Not half a mile away, across a shallow valley, stand 8,000 English warriors. The best of them wielding battle axes that can cleave a man in two. Duke William strikes the first blow. Most of Harold's archers are still marching to join him. The reply is left to his elite guard, his housecarls, as William of Poitiers would record.
The English hurled back spears and javelins and weapons of all kinds, together with axes and stones fastened to pieces of wood. You would have thought to see our men overwhelmed by this death-dealing weight of projectiles.
When the two armies meet, the English live up to their reputation. Norman steel cannot break the wall of English shields.
The English fought confidently with all their strength, striving to prevent the attackers from penetrating within their ranks, which indeed were so closely massed together that even the dead had not the space to fall.
Now, William calls for his knights. Robert is riding into his first battle. Everything, training, armor, rider, depend on his horse, the Norman stallion. Bred for size and strength, and trained to lash out at the foe. When he charges, Robert will guide his war horse only with his legs. His right hand holds his lance, his left his shield. Like all Norman knights, Robert belongs to a lifelong unit of 25 men, a connois, who fight under their own flag. Should they become separated in battle, they can rally to their standard. On any other field, they would charge in waves, 5 men knee to knee, standing in their stirrups with lances leveled. Today, faced with an unyielding mass of shields, they use a different tactic. They attack one by one, hurling their lances and wheeling away. The knights open holes in the English line, and the Norman infantry rush forward to widen them. The English cut their own gaps with the battle axe. By early afternoon, neither army has the advantage, and both fall back to tend their wounds. Norman arrows now do their worst. Barbed at the tip, they can't be pulled out. Surgeons must push them straight through the wound. When the fighting resumes, William resorts to a favorite tactic. What Norman strength has not won, Norman trickery might. No sooner have the Normans attacked than they seem to retreat.
Several thousand gave rapid pursuit to those they thought to be in flight. But the Normans, suddenly wheeling their horses, surrounded them and cut down their pursuers.
The ruse works. Without their wall of shields, the English are defenseless against Norman steeds and Norman steel. A rumor flies through the English ranks. King Harold has been shot through the eye. His men fight on, but with their leader lost, so is the battle.
Many lay on the ground, bathed in blood. Others, who struggled to their feet, found themselves too weak to escape.
The field and the victory belong to William. But the courage of one young knight would not be overlooked.
A certain Norman recruit, Robert, son of Roger de Beaumont, experiencing battle for the first time that day, performed feats of valor worthy of perpetual remembrance. He attacked with utmost bravery and success.
Robert receives more than praise. He is rewarded with English land and an English title, Earl of Leicester. As for Duke William, 3 horses have been killed from under him this day. He has earned both his throne and the name history will award him, William the Conqueror. On Christmas Day, 1066, he is crowned King of England. What the Normans have done, no other army would ever do. Never again would England's shores be breached by men from across the sea.
They swept down from the mountains like a torrent and roared over the land. Half man they seemed, half beast, as wild as the hills they emerged from. In battle, none were more reckless, none more fearless. So terrible did they appear that their foes might turn and run before a blow was struck. They fought for nothing less than victory and mocked death itself. BC, a Celtic army marches to battle, a hunger for land. Each Celtic tribe was led by a king and his chieftains, yet they could make no decision without the assembly of nobles, the men who held power, since they were the men who fought. In peacetime, they quarreled and dueled among themselves without cease. In time of war, they were invincible. At the end of the 4th century BC, a group of such men was called upon to gather their goods and their families and head south to Italy. There they would make new homes.
The king, wishing to relieve his kingdom of the burdensome excess of the population, announced his intention of sending his 2 nephews, both of them adventurous young men, out into the world to find...
loosely joined by language, custom, and belief, the clans came to blows with one another over land, or wealth, or simply pride. Throughout the countryside, poor families tilled the soil on behalf of a nobleman. In return for a share of their harvest, they received the protection of his sword. A craving for booty pushes them on mile after mile. No obstacle, natural or human, hinders the wild men of Western Europe. Their enemy, the small young state called Rome, has never met such a foe. Much later, the historian Livy would record their coming with alarm, too late for his countrymen.
A strange foe of whose power Rome knew nothing was on the march from the Atlantic Ocean and the farthest shores of the world. They flamed into the uncontrollable anger characteristic of their race and set forward with terrible speed on the path to Rome.
The Celts' exploits would be handed down by their victims, the Romans. They left no records of their own. Of their lives before, little is known. But by the 4th century BC, Europe was covered by a mosaic of Celtic tribes.
Such new homes as the gods by signs from heaven might point the way to.
There were plenty of adventurous young men to make the journey. From childhood, the sons of noblemen were taught the ways of war.
Fathers do not allow their sons to approach them openly until they have grown to an age when they can bear the burden of military service.
The king's nephews had grown up with swords and spears and shields. Together, the youths of the tribe had trained and hunted, feasted and drunk. Now, together, they would fight.
They set out with a vast host, some mounted, some on foot, and reached the foot of the Alps. Those sky peaks into another world. These they crossed. They defeated the Etruscans and founded the town of Mediolanum.